Welcome back to A Good Length. I'm Dr. Vinuba. I want to ask a question I've been throwing around in my head for a little while now. What if the feminist movement that changed how women see themselves also gives us a roadmap for how men need to change, grow, and evolve to suit the modern world? Today, I want to talk about feminism as a case study of arguably the most successful identity movement of the last century, and the lessons it carries for modern men who are serious about our evolution as a species. Because while the world around men has changed, men's internal perception of manhood largely didn't. And I think that's why modern men find ourselves in the situation we are in today. Over the last 60 to 70 years, feminism has expanded what a woman could be. And it's been largely successful in doing so. Most people would acknowledge this intuitively, but rarely speak about it publicly, as it's such a socially charged topic that's met with a surge of emotion. A woman in 2026 can be a mother, a CEO, financially independent, relationally fluid, a stay-at-home parent, or choose not to have kids at all without being socially shamed for it. Women are supported to be either sexually autonomous or celibate, politically ambitious or domestically focused, emotionally expressive or stoic, outspoken or quiet, or any combination or all of the above. There is no role, job, or position that is now deemed unacceptable for a woman to occupy. It's hard not to acknowledge the positive social change that has come from feminism. But that change didn't happen by accident or good fortune. It happened because of a movement that was imperfect, contested, sometimes contradictory, but a movement that consistently pushed a single message: that a woman's worth is not defined by one role. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir laid the intellectual groundwork for this in the 1940s, 1950s, when she wrote that a person is not born a woman, they become one, and that identity is constructed. And she went on to rightly argue that if an identity can be constructed, it can be reconstructed. Then Betty Friedan gave it a popular voice in 1963, describing what she called the problem that has no name. And that is the quiet desperation of women whose entire identity was folded into domesticity and dependency. But today, I'm not asking the question about whether we should agree with every strand of feminist thought. I absolutely do not want to invite that onto myself. What I'm stating is something more specific and more urgent. And that is that men in 2026 are still largely operating inside a comparatively narrow and historically constructed template, and one that has never really been critically reviewed, at least not in a meaningful way. That template for how to be a man sounds like this: learn to become a provider, a protector, stoic, useful, economically productive, and emotionally restrained. And when this is threatened through destabilizing circumstances such as divorce, job loss, death, or family breakdown, something deeper is damaged. Our entire identity as men dramatically collapses, and we're left asking, if I'm no longer needed in a traditional way, then what is my role and purpose now? And that is the defining psychological question for men of our generation. And it's one that we do not discuss nearly enough. Richard Reeves argues that men are experiencing a silent crisis: declining educational attainment, reduced workforce participation, deteriorating mental health, and a collapse of social purpose. And all of this is happening largely outside public discourse. The manosphere, for all of its dysfunction, didn't just emerge from nowhere. Underneath all the anger, resentment, the red pill alpha male vitriol that we hear, there is a very real fear that many men are carrying, which goes something like this: the world has changed, my role has changed, my value feels uncertain, and no one has handed me a new map. Feminism, on the other hand, presented women with a new map, and that map may have been somewhat imperfect and still being drawn, but it was a map nonetheless. A navigation tool with which women could chart their journey forward, while men today are still looking for their map, their cultural identity. Over time, the goalposts for masculine provision and requirements have gradually changed. While men remain stuck aiming for historic targets of identity, and then wondering why they are not scoring or moving forward. So what exactly can a healthy masculinity movement learn from the successful parts of feminism? In order to expand male identity, as feminism did for female identity, we need to achieve a few things. We need to expand masculine identity beyond one role. We need to develop emotional literacy. We need to build male support networks and brotherhood. We need to stop defining our worth through utility and provision, develop independence before partnership, separate advocacy from hatred, and perhaps most importantly, create a positive vision of masculinity. So let me talk through these in a little bit more detail. The first point I mentioned is expanding male identity beyond one role. Feminism's greatest structural achievement was widening the definition of what a woman could be. In other words, not replacing an identity, but expanding it. And men need the same. Right now, too many men are trapped inside a single lane to be a provider, stoic worker, protector, and a emotionally restrained achiever. And the moment that lane closes through circumstances such as redundancy, divorce, injury, or illness, there's nothing underneath it all. And we are all at sea about how to continue to navigate our world, as if we have no compass to get our bearings. Much like feminism rightly championed things like women's economic independence, fertility options, and expanded occupational opportunities, a healthy masculinity movement should make room for men who are emotionally articulate, domestically competent, community-oriented, nurturing fathers, creative, relationally intelligent, and vulnerable without surrendering strength. And like feminism taught us, we do not need to replace masculinity, we need to expand it. And ensure that we're not tied to a single lane such that we leave ourselves exposed and vulnerable to external influences. Ultimately, the goal is not to make men more like women, but rather to make men a greater, more capable, and independent versions of themselves. We know that rigid masculinity norms harm men, not because strength is wrong, but because narrow definitions create fragility. And a man who can only be one thing breaks when that one thing is taken from him. Next, we need to develop emotional literacy. Men have been taught through cultural conversations to suppress emotion, to solve problems alone, to never appear weak, and to endure silently and push through. And that comes with measurable, documented, and devastating costs. We know that men die by suicide at 3 to 4 times the rate of women in Australia. They seek mental health support at half the rate. They are less likely to see a doctor when they're ill. They're less likely to disclose pain and less likely to ask for help in general. And that is our current failing as men, and it leads to measurable and tangible negative consequences. Emotional regulation is a trainable skill, not a personality trait. The ability to identify, name, and process emotion can slowly be built over time. And to become emotionally competent men, we need to steer away from both emotional chaos, as well as performative softness. Healthy masculinity should teach men how to regulate anger without suppressing it, and how to communicate clearly, how to process grief, how to identify shame, how to tolerate vulnerability, and most importantly, how to ask for help without it feeling like surrender. And all of that is masculinity being upgraded to become relevant in the modern world. We also need to prioritize building male support networks and expanding brotherhood. One of feminism's most underrated achievements was actually structural, not philosophical. Women built communities, advocacy groups, mentorship networks, a shared language for shared experiences, and notably, they established public solidarity. Men are, by almost every metric, more socially isolated than women. Research from Cigna's 2020 Loneliness Index found that 61% of American adults report feeling lonely. And men were disproportionately represented, particularly in the over 45 age group. After divorce or career disruption, many men discover that they have no emotional support networks outside of their romantic partner. Many men rely entirely on their partner for emotional intimacy. And when that relationship ends, the silence is total and absolute. Male community spaces where men can be honest with each other without performance matter greatly because of what they demonstrate. That men talking seriously and vulnerably and with intellectual honesty is not weakness. What men need is not endless venting, but a strong sense of brotherhood. Feeling like they are in a safe space amongst other like-minded creatures who can relate to their suffering. Dr. Anna Machen is an evolutionary anthropologist who argues that male friendship and paternal bonds are amongst the most undervalued forces in human flourishing, and that the modern social environment is systematically starving men of both. In Dr. Machen, we have an educated, articulate woman championing fathers' rights on our behalf. Yet as men, we struggle to do this for ourselves. And in this respect, we need to do better. The fourth point I mentioned above was just that. Men need to stop defining worth purely through utility. Women fought hard against being valued only for beauty, fertility, domestic labour, and caregiving. The feminist critique was that a woman's worth is not reducible to her usefulness to others. Look at some of the metrics about how we judge our own worth as men. Income, status, productivity, usefulness, sexual success. And we do so unconsciously, constantly, and quietly. And that creates a specific kind of fragility that I see in men all around me. And something that I identified in myself as I reflect on my own painful experiences. And we see it every day. A man who loses his job and then proceeds to lose himself. A man who retires and then falls apart. A man who goes through divorce and cannot conceive who he is without being a husband and provider. Don't get me wrong here. Ambition still matters. Provision still matters. And competence, of course, still matters. But losing a job, relationship, money, status should not cause us to psychologically collapse into meaninglessness and uselessness. Male shame is almost entirely tied to one message, and that is, do not be perceived as weak, soft, or inadequate. Do not stop being useful. Warren Farrell has argued for decades that men have been treated as expendable, as human doings rather than human beings, that their worth is conditional on what they produce, not who they are, and that, right there, is a trap. We also need to encourage independence before partnership. One of feminism's most liberating messages to women was this: build a life for yourself first. And then a relationship should add to it, not define it. And that is extraordinarily good advice. And if we're being honest, men need that advice as much as women today, if not more. Underneath all the venom that spits from the manosphere space, the message about building a self-identity is ultimately what that philosophy is about. And I think that concept has a lot of merit. Unfortunately, that message is being taken to its extreme and not at all being delivered in a respectful, articulate, and dignified manner. Many men are still unconsciously building their entire emotional world around their partners. And so when relationships fail, some men find that they never develop the critical capacities independently. Capacities such as domestic competence, emotional self-sufficiency, social connection, parenting capability, financial clarity, and purpose that isn't relationship contingent. As men, we need to commit to developing that independent capability, and that means learning how to cook, to clean, to parent our own children independently, to manage our own finances, to build our own friendships, to regulate our own emotional state, to maintain our purpose, and to create our own meaning. These are not skills that we can develop in a short period of time. They take a lifelong commitment to develop and sustain them. And men need to prioritize this urgently. Not because women are unnecessary, but because emotional, domestic, and relational dependency creates fragility and leaves us vulnerable and exposed to changes in life circumstances. And that kind of fragility in men has consequences for everyone around them. The strongest relationships are between two people who continue to intentionally choose each other, not two people who need each other to survive. And that's a lesson that I've learned the hard way, and I've become wiser from it. The modern man's goal should be to build a meaningful life with their partner, but also not collapse without their partner. We also need to separate advocacy from hatred. One of the feminist movement's strengths was advocating for women's well-being without requiring hatred of men. The moment a men's movement becomes anti-female, it has already failed. Because a movement built on resentment cannot grow men, it only ends up calcifying their wounds. The manosphere contains real-world observations about real male pain. Observations such as loneliness, lack of purpose, dating instability, family breakdown, loss of identity, and social isolation. But when those observations are funneled through blame, cynicism, and humiliation-based content, they start harming everyone. Jordan Peterson, for all the controversy that he evokes currently, surmises that men need to pick up responsibility, not because the world is fair, but because it is a path to meaning. His argument is not about domination, but rather about direction. The strongest movements in life are aspirational, not resentful. Male advocacy must be able to say men are struggling, men deserve support, and male experiences deserve serious attention. All without blaming this on women. That distinction is the line between a movement that helps men grow and one that keeps them stuck in a quagmire of malevolence. The last and perhaps most important point about a much-needed, impactful, and successful masculinity movement is to create a positive vision of masculinity. Feminism, at its most powerful, created a vision of what women could become. It was future-focused and didn't involve itself too much in the denigration of men. Today, a lot of modern masculinity content focuses too heavily on decline, on blame, and social criticism. And while some of that criticism is valid, men also need aspiration, meaning, direction, and ideals that are worth building toward. A truly positive manhood movement needs to be optimistically forward-facing, not retrospectively resentful. A healthy masculine framework includes principles such as discipline, competence, integrity, emotional mastery, meaningful fatherhood, purpose, leadership, service, resilience, protectiveness, self-respect, domestic capability, and many others. Research by Dr. Noel Clarke and colleagues on positive masculinity frameworks suggests that men who hold flexible and expansive identities show measurably better mental health outcomes, stronger relationship satisfaction, and greater life meaning. Historically, it hasn't just been women trapped by gender roles. Men have been too, just in different ways. The feminist critique focused rightly on how women were constrained, but we haven't actually acknowledged that men also had conditional worth. A man who couldn't provide, fight, work, or endure hardship became socially invisible. So the modern transition is psychologically difficult precisely because many men were never taught an identity beyond usefulness, one that was independent of their role. And now the world needs men to build this quickly, with fewer maps and guides. Women spent 60 years learning how not to need men for survival. And men now need to learn how not to need women for identity or domestic responsibilities. And I think that's one of the defining psychological and social challenges of the next 20 years. You see, the modern relationship is shifting from necessity to voluntary partnership. Historically, many women depended on men economically, and many men depended on women domestically and emotionally. And yet, as women gained financial independence, one side of that dependency equation changed dramatically. But many men never developed the other side. That is, the domestic competence, the emotional self-sufficiency, and the social infrastructure that women often built. So when divorce comes, when job loss comes, and when the relationship ends, a lot of men discover there's nothing underneath, and that has to change. The end game for modern relationships should be two people who are capable of standing independently, yet choose each other freely. And that is difficult as it requires and demands more from men. Now, everything we've been talking about, including emotional independence, domestic independence, the danger of defining yourself entirely through someone else, all of it becomes most urgent when children are involved. For the last half century, one of the loudest and most celebrated messages of the women's movement was for mothers and women to build their financial independence and not structure their life so that their economic survival depends entirely on a man. To have their own income, career, and financial identity. That advice was hard-won, and it was right, and it changed the world. Today, modern fathers need to hear that very same message, just apply it to a different domain, and that is to develop parenting and domestic independence. Because just as women who had no financial independence were vulnerable historically, a father today who has no independent parenting capability is vulnerable in ways that most men never see coming until it's too late. Unfortunately, I found that out the hard way, as I spent too much time focusing on providing for my family rather than developing my domestic, parenting, and emotional independence. And over the last 3 years, I reflected on these capabilities and want to break those three concepts of domestic parenting and emotional independence down a little further here. Domestic independence means you can run a household fully and without assistance. It means you know how to cook and not just survive on toast and takeaway, but actually be able to feed yourself and your children in a way that supports their health and development. It means you know where the school uniforms are, you know the grocery situation in the fridge and pantry. You know what needs replacing and when. It means that as a man, you are able to manage the systems, rhythms, and logistics of family life that in many households still fall overwhelmingly and asymmetrically on women. Research from the Australian Institute of Family Studies consistently show that even in dual income households, women perform a significantly disproportionate share of unpaid domestic labour. The 2021 ABS Time Use Survey found that Australian women average nearly twice the time on unpaid domestic work compared to men. And when the household runs because of someone else's invisible labour, and that person leaves, many men suddenly discover they have no idea how to run their own home. And a man who doesn't know how to run every aspect of his household isn't in any way independent. And that is a structural vulnerability that affects children's stability, a man's legal position, and his own psychological resilience. Next is parenting independence, and this matters enormously in a family law context, though its importance extends far beyond the legal ramifications. Parenting independence means that you are an active, informed, capable parent in every domain of your child's life. Not a co-parent who defers to the mother, not a weekend parent who only shows up for fun, but an active parent who knows all the operational detail of his children's lives. And take it from a man who didn't have that parenting independence and then had that used against him in the courtroom as justification for taking his children away to the other side of the country. So, knowing what I know now, if I had to advise my younger self about developing my parenting independence, this is what I would say to him. Do the school drop-offs and pickups regularly such that the school staff know your face, that other parents know your name, and you become a visible presence in the school community. Attend as many parent-teacher interviews as you can. Prioritize them. Know the teacher's name before you walk in. Know what subjects the children are excelling at and where they're struggling. Read the school report cards. Have questions prepared for the teacher so it does not seem like you're there as a passenger. Take the children to medical appointments. Know the names of their doctors. Know their medications and dosages, their allergies, their health history. Get involved with their homework. Sit with them and understand what they're studying and help them as much as you can. Attend as many extracurricular activities as you possibly can. Know the coach's name, know the training schedule and upcoming meets and games, and drive them there and watch them compete so they can see you there as a sign of support. Know the children's social world, their friends, where they hang out, and the social dynamics of their friendship circle. Knowing your children's lives is not a bonus feature of fatherhood, it's a critical part of the job. All of these were used against me in legal proceedings to paint me out as a part-time secondary parent. In fact, these are the vulnerabilities that are commonly used against most men to influence custody schedules in favour of the mother. It is well documented that men who are only peripherally involved in their children's lives will continue to be offered just that, peripheral involvement. Men who play an equal or significant part in the domestic and parenting duties protect themselves in a family law court. Consistent, specific paternal involvement also creates measurable benefits in children. The involvement of fathers in the daily routine of a child's life is one of the strongest predictors of child well-being across almost every domain. In family law systems across the Western world, the standard used for assessing parenting arrangements is what is called the best interest of the child. And one of the key factors that courts consider is which parent has been the primary carer. Which parent has been the one managing the day-to-day life of the child? A father who has been a good provider but whose involvement in his children's lives is limited finds himself in a profoundly weak position when that is challenged in custody disputes. Unfortunately, presence and provision is not evidence enough in family court. We need to demonstrate active participation and involvement. Under the Family Law Act, Australian courts assess parenting on the basis of demonstrated involvement, established relationships, and the capacity of each parent to meet the child's needs. A parent who can speak in specific detail about the child's teachers, health, friendships, and is intimately involved in their daily routine carries a very different weight in the courtroom than one who cannot. The third type of independence is emotional independence. And that means that your psychological stability as a father does not depend entirely on the relationship with the other parent. It means you can be a regulated, consistent, calm presence for your children, regardless of what is happening in your adult relationship. And while this may sound simple, it's actually extraordinarily difficult. Many fathers who go through separation discover that they have been emotionally co-regulating through their partner for years, relying on their partner or wife to process, contain, and manage the emotional temperature of the household. And when that relationship fractures, they are left with no infrastructure for their own emotional management. And so they dissolve into a cocktail of emotional turbulence. Unprocessed stress and emotional dysregulation doesn't disappear. It surfaces in the body, in reactivity, in the quality of attention we can offer the people around us. And our children pick up on this. They are extremely sensitive to the emotional state of their parents. Not just what the parents say, but how the parents feel and how they feel when the parents are in the room. We underappreciate children's ability to become attuned to the emotional ambience of their parents' relationship. I reflect on when my ex-wife blindsided me with her decision to end our marriage. There were many times where, due to a combination of shock, disbelief, anger, grief, sense of failure, and shame, that I became emotionally dysregulated and acted in ways that were either out of character or showed very little emotional mastery. I was unable to be fully present for my boys even when I was physically there with them. And children absolutely noticed the difference. It took me several months to understand that my children needed me to be regulated far more than they needed me to be perfect. And this also protects children from becoming the emotional conduits through which we process the pain of divorce and separation. And that is one of the most loving things that you can do as a father. Emotional independence also means having your own support system, such as therapists, friends groups, or a men's group that you can be honest with. It also means having a regular practice of some sort, whether that's physical training, creative work, meditation, or anything else that maintains your psychological floor. Now, before I carry on, I just want to be clear that none of what I'm saying today is an argument that divorce is inevitable or that men should approach fatherhood through the lens of self-protection. When I say that a father should know the teacher's name or attend the appointments, run the household or manage the schedule, I'm not saying these things to prepare men for a custody dispute. I'm saying them because they are what it means to be a father. But of course, all that also protects your rights and responsibilities as a father, as well as your children's rights to have a relationship with both parents. Because everything that I'm mentioning is not just a playbook for defensive strategies. They are fundamental parenting skills that are applicable not just to men, but to society at large. For example, a mother who develops financial independence is not doing it because she's planning to leave. She does it because financial capability is part of being a complete adult. Because dependency creates fragility. And because the world is more unpredictable than we planned for. So it's only sensible to ensure we have contingencies. That very same logic also applies to men. A father who knows his children's lives in specific detail, can run the household, can manage his own emotional world, is a better father, is a more equal partner, is more present and shares the load. And should the worst happen and the relationship fail, he is also an extremely competent and strong father who cannot be sidelined, ridiculed, or minimized. Not because he fought for it in a courtroom, but because he deeply embraced fatherhood, day by day, while ensuring his children have an admirable and inspirational male presence in their lives. A father who is merely a provider is vulnerable, but a father who is a provider and an active caregiver is much harder to marginalize. And that word marginalize is exactly what I felt when my kids were taken away from me. But in today's world, that is exactly what can happen to a father when his role is defined entirely by income or provider status. It is so clearly evident that family courts and some parts of society see a father's presence as optional. His identity in his children's lives becomes contingent on the goodwill of the mother. And when that goodwill disappears for whatever reason, he finds himself fighting to reclaim a presence he never should have relinquished in the first place. And I say that as a criticism of myself first, as much as other men. But to be honest, most men are doing exactly what they were taught to do: provide, protect, work, be strong, and keep it together. But the world has significantly changed, and it's high time that the definition of fatherhood and manhood changes with it. And as I wind up the episode today, I want to leave you with a summary of my closing thoughts. Just like feminism expanded female identity, a healthy masculinity movement must expand male identity without erasing masculinity in itself. And that is the critical balancing act of our generation. It is a thing that I think about as a father with two sons who've been forced to grow up away from their father. And as a man who has had to rebuild parts of himself that he didn't even know were eroded or missing. The next evolution of masculinity is not about domination or resentment, it's about competent independence. It's about men who can simultaneously provide and protect while also nurturing, connecting, parenting, and emotionally regulating, all without losing strength, ambition, or their identity in the process. Women spent decades building economic autonomy, and as men, we need to learn the lessons from this and build our own emotional, domestic, and relational autonomy ourselves. And I'm convinced that we'll find that healthy relationships will emerge when both people are capable, not when one or both people are dependent. Hopefully you found some value in this episode, and if so, I ask that you share it with someone who needs it or might find it useful. These are important conversations that need to happen in our living rooms, in offices, boardrooms, locker rooms, and pubs all across the world. I'm Dr. Beauvoir Midi, and I hope this conversation today has landed on a good length. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.